Thank you. Please.
Alex Emmons with The Intercept. I wanted to ask about Secretary Kerry's comments this week on MSNBC about Yemen.
Okay.
He said, I think the Saudis, and this is a quote, expressed their desire to make certain that they're not endangering civilians. And the statement that he's referencing there from the coalition said that coalition forces have fully complied with international law and have a robust process to ensure all targets are genuinely military, and it goes on to say they've never used cluster bombs. So my question is, this is a coalition that has targeted clinics and hospitals and schools and factories. How can Secretary Kerry possibly take their assertions that they're trying not to endanger civilians at face value?
So a couple of points to make on that. One is Saudi Arabia has created an investigation commission to look into and evaluate its military targeting to ensure the protection of civilians, as well as to investigate any incidents of civilian casualties or civilian harm during the conflict in Yemen. We've also engaged regularly with Saudi Arabia, as well as other coalition members, on the need to investigate all credible reports of civilian casualties allegedly caused by coalition airstrikes, and have reminded the Saudis of their obligations under end-use provisions. I'm talking about cluster munitions in this case, as well as encouraging them to do their utmost to avoid harm to civilian populations and to avoid damaging critical infrastructure.
Sure. But the only strike we've seen them investigate so far publicly was the attack on an MSF hospital back in October.
Right.
And their ambassador to the UN later said that, although he said that that was a mistake, he said that it was because MSF provided the wrong coordinates. So I guess are we trusting them to investigate their own war crimes? Should they accede to UN investigation of their war crimes?
I think this is obviously something that we are in continued dialogue with Saudi Arabia about. We have been very clear about our concerns about civilian casualties. We do believe that they are able to conduct credible investigations into some of these incidents. But our emphasis more largely, or more broadly rather, is on the UN political process. We have been very clear that there's no military solution to what's happening in Yemen, and there is a UN process that needs to be adhered to and pursued by all parties.
Mark?
Yeah.
Hi, nice to see you again.
Nice to see you too.
So sort of a follow-up.
Sure.
We've been talking about different wrong things that your friends and allies are doing around the world. And so the UN has looked into what Ukraine is doing, what Kiev is doing, and they have come to the conclusion that the Kiev government allows torture, runs secret jails. What is your response to the UN report?
I'm sorry, you're referring to what report exactly?
Ivan Simonovic, and it's in the Times today, in the Times of London. The SBU is systematically rounding up and torturing suspected rebel sympathizers. UN Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights made the presentation in Kiev today.
Oh, okay.
And then he
I
presented
think I know
a
what- yeah.
report.
So we have read the report.
You have.
We have. I know you're shocked. We actually read reports. We're deeply troubled that the conflict in Ukraine has now claimed over 9,000 lives and injured more than 20,000 people. We once again call on the so-called authorities in this separatist-controlled areas to cease their human rights abuses, including killings, tortures, ill treatment, illegal detention, forced labor, as well as restrictions on freedom of movement, peaceful assembly, and expression. We also call on them to allow in UN monitors, whose mandate would cover the entirety of Ukraine, including Crimea and the eastern part of Ukraine. And at the same time, we also call on the government of Ukraine to ensure a prompt and thorough and transparent investigation and appropriate prosecution of all persons responsible for alleged incidents of abuses perpetrated by its forces, including those contained that are described in the UN report.
So it's a UN report. It's
it is a UN report.
Alleged means what? UN alleges that?
Yes, and we, as I said, we call on the Ukrainian government to hold its own forces and own people accountable for their actions in these incidents.
One incident that we've been calling for Ukraine to have people accountable is the massacre in Odessa, the Holocaust in Odessa 2 years ago.
Yeah,
This same guy, Mr. Simonovic, the same UN person, said there's been, quote unquote, no significant progress in that investigation. How much more time do we need for the investigation to become significant, to make significant progress?
Well, first of all, obviously it was a terrible tragedy, what occurred in Odessa. And we've been very clear since the immediate aftermath of that tragedy that we believe it should be promptly or fully investigated by the Ukrainian authorities. And we continue that, to urge that.
And lastly,
but it's really for them to speak to the timeline for that investigation.
Since this is a government that you, I would call it sponsor and defend at any turn, at every turn, do you accept any responsibility of your own for what that government is doing and not doing in terms of upholding human rights?
Well, Andrei, I would respond to your question by reminding everyone in this room what has happened in Ukraine, which is that Russia seized territory belonging to the country of Ukraine, Crimea, and then supported separatists in eastern Ukraine to create a conflict that the government of Ukraine and the armed forces of Ukraine have been struggling to deal with for the past several years. So let's be very clear on the fact that a sovereign nation had its sovereignty violated by its neighbor, Russia, and continues to respond to that threat on its soil. It has made a number of reforms, both economic and political, and has made a consistent effort to comply with its commitments on the Minsk agreement. We have not seen, frankly, Russia or the separatist backs meet that same standard. So let's be very clear about where the responsibility for the situation in Ukraine lies. Please.